An essential step in the marketing research process is defining the problem. And we're looking at situations where managers have to choose among different alternatives, and they need information on which alternative is the best one to go with. And this may be things such as selecting among new product offerings, choosing between different advertising alternatives, choosing between the pricing differences they could have for their products, the dealers they would go with, and so on. So if we consider a situation once suggested by the marketing research director of Betty Crocker, he stated that chefs bring us 3 new cookie recipes, A, B, and C. A decision consists of decision alternatives. So the decision alternative is that we'll pursue only one recipe at a time. So we could do a couple of things. We could proceed with further customer testing of the new cookie recipe, should it be A, B, or C, or do not proceed with further consumer testing of these new recipes. Because the manager has to choose between these decision alternatives, they do not already have the information they need as well. So they really do need to conduct the marketing research. So if they had 2 choices, proceed with consumer testing or do not, in this case, they need to proceed because they don't have the information which would be the best alternative to choose. So in defining the problem, managers must first determine what decisions they need to make. Secondly, they have to determine what is information they need to make those decisions. What do they have adequate information to make a decision? And you shouldn't conduct marketing research just to know something because it does take time and money. You need it if you need to do marketing research if you do not have adequate information to make a decision. The research objectives are based off of the problem. So once you've got the problem defined and you know the alternatives, the research objectives state what the researcher must do, what information must be produced so that managers can choose the correct decision alternative to solve the problem. So a research objective should be very specific and should satisfy 4 criteria. Who do we get the information from? What information is needed? Specify the unit of measurement used to gather the information, and word questions used to gather the information in the respondent's frame of reference. So, we have to define the problem correctly because if we don't, then the rest of the marketing research efforts will basically prove useless. So, if we define the problem correctly, then we've halfway solved the problem. A good definition is necessary if marketing research is going to contribute to a solution of the problem. And a bad definition of the problem dooms the entire project. So there isn't a universally agreed upon process for defining the problem and the objectives. It's more of an art than a science. So here's a flow chart, And we're going to have control systems that we have in place that monitor things like market share, profit margin, pricing, things of that nature. And if we fail to meet some objective that we've specified as our management goals, then the control system will tell us that. Oftentimes people or organizations have opportunity identification systems also, and they may alert us to a potential opportunity in the market. So with those two things, an opportunity or a failure to meet objectives, those are sources of problems. With that, we can define our problem, and then we would look at if we can't define the problem with what we have to that point, then we would do a situational analysis, look at the symptoms, validate the symptoms, determine probable causes for the symptoms, and validate those in order to more completely define our problem. If we do have our problem well defined, then we could go out for a request for proposal to help us get resources to come up with a solution. So we'll look, once we have our problem defined, then we will look at the alternatives that are part of the decision that has to be made. So to solve the problem, we're going to make a decision, and we're going to choose among different alternatives. And here's the next set of steps. We specify the decision alternatives, look at the consequences of the alternatives, identify the assumptions of these consequences, and then look for the information we have at hand and assess its adequacy. If we have adequate information at hand to make a decision, then we just go ahead and make the decision. If we don't, then we need more research. So then we have to state our research objectives, specify the information needed to choose among the alternatives, and those are: who do we get the information from? How do we measure it? What's the correct unit of measure? And we have to capture the information in terms of the respondent's frame of reference so that they understand what we're getting after. So, a problem exists when there's a gap between what is supposed to happen and what did happen. And we normally think of this as having a problem. An opportunity occurs when there is a gap between what did happen and what could have happened. A marketing opportunity has been defined as the area of buyer need or potential interest in which the company can perform profitably. So an example is Volkswagen's decision to introduce a natural gas car to the US market. That's an opportunity. So managers have a problem, though. They must determine whether or how to take advantage of it. So there's decisions that need to be made. So the only thing worse than having a problem is having a problem and not being aware of it. For the problem source, failure to meet an objective, we use a control system to recognize this problem. For managers to recognize a problem when the source is failure to meet objectives, they must be knowledgeable of objectives and actual performance. To control is one of the basic functions of management. Management must also be aware of opportunities, and unless they have a system for monitoring them, sometimes known as a process for opportunity identification, they will probably not act. So the role of symptoms. Managers must be careful to avoid confusing symptoms with problems. The problem is going to be found among all the factors that cause us to have these symptoms. Symptoms are not the problem, but the signals that alert us to a problem. So symptoms can be considered changes in the level of some key metric. Things like sales are falling, market share is down, customer satisfaction is down, product returns are up, complaint letters are up. So the role of a symptom is to alert management to a problem. And there's a gap between what should be happening and what is actually happening. So when managers recognize there is a problem, they must identify the decision alternatives that they can choose to solve that problem. So when management defines the problem in terms of a decision to be made, researchers should ensure managers are defining the problem correctly. Researchers must resist the temptation to accept the first definition of the problem suggested by management. They should take time to conduct their own investigation and to develop and consider alternative definitions to the problem. A situational analysis is a form of exploratory research taken to gather background information, and it's useful in helping to identify and correct the problem. So ITBs are invitations to bid, and RFPs are requests for proposal. So they're often used in the marketing research process, and both can happen when management has predetermined the problem decision and is calling on researchers to present a research proposal to be considered by management. So the significance of an ITB or RFP is that researchers still have an obligation to ensure that the managers have defined the problem correctly. If the problem is confirmed, the decision to be made is stated, and we are now ready to proceed to the specification of decision, which includes developing the decision alternatives. However, if the researcher cannot confirm the problem as stated by management, then they have to discuss the situation with management. If the researcher cannot convince the manager to abandon the ill-defined problem, then they have an ethical dilemma. They don't want to go forward with something that is going to cost the company money and not really correct the situation. So managers are going to, we need to conduct a situational analysis when managers sense something is wrong and they need help in diagnosing the problem. So the researcher is involved to get a professional, well-trained, methodical second view on the situational analysis. So the researcher should conduct a situational analysis to ensure that the problem has been properly defined. So the first thing, validate the symptoms of the problem. The researcher should clarify the symptoms. Are the symptoms true, or are they just errors in the control systems? Can the symptoms be corroborated by other factors? Are they aberrant? In other words, it was a one-off situation and it's not likely to appear again. So it's the researcher's role to explore and question the problem. Determine the probable causes of the symptom. So we have to determine all possible causes. If you do only a partial list, then the real cause may be overlooked, and we would end up making an incorrect decision. After listing the possible causes, the researcher should then narrow down the probable causes, which would be a smaller subset. And these are defined as the most likely factors giving rise to the symptoms. So decision alternatives include any marketing action that the marketing manager thinks may resolve the problem. We also have to look for consequences of our decision alternatives. Consequences are the results of marketing actions. What are the most likely consequences we can anticipate with each decision alternative? If we do not know these consequences, marketing research can help us by providing information that allows us to predict the consequences. So then we are at the stage where we specify the decision. We identify the manager's assumptions about the consequences, and looking at the figure here, after we identify the consequences of the decision alternatives, we must address the assumptions we have made in stating these consequences. So decision makers make assumptions when they assign consequences to their decision alternatives. Assumptions are assertions that certain conditions exist or that certain reactions will take place if the considered alternatives are implemented. If we don't feel that information is likely to make certain assumptions, then we'll likely need new information. And that's information, of course, that's gathered by marketing research. So next, we specify the research objectives. We have to assess the adequacy of information on hand. Then if the information is adequate, there's no need for research. If a researcher questions a manager about his or her beliefs regarding the consequences, it may turn out that the manager really is not certain. It's imperative that the manager's assumptions be analyzed for validity. So the researcher asks questions about the current state of information and determines the desired state. If there's a discrepancy between the current information level and the desired information level, then we have an information gap. Ultimately, information gaps are the basis for establishing research objectives. Exactly what information is needed to close the information gap? This question leads us to the next step, which is creating the research objectives. Research objectives state what information must be produced by the research project. Hypotheses are essentially statements of the decision alternatives' assumed consequences. They can also be helpful in determining the research objectives. the key assessment to be made is, can a decision alternative be selected if we gather the information in the research objectives? So again, the research objective should say who we're getting the information from, what information we need, the unit of measure, and we have to word the questions in the respondent's frame of reference. So the first one, from whom are we gathering information? The research objective should not only specify who is to provide the information, but also state how these persons are to be included in the sample. What constructs do we wish to measure? Exactly what information do we need to make our choice among the decision alternatives? What's the unit of measurement? So, for example, to construct an intention to buy, like we saw for our hybrid car example, it may be measured on a scale ranging from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10. Researchers can assess sources of information that provide them with operational definitions needed to measure these many constructs. So when formulating research objectives, the information requested from respondents must be worded in the respondent's frame of reference. Every industry has its own jargon, and we need to avoid jargon in our marketing research. The purpose of an action standard is to define what action will be taken given the results of the research findings. Action standards require you to make important decisions before you collect your information, and they serve as clear guidelines for action once the research is over. So, action standards require the client to focus on deciding in advance what information he or she will need in order to take action. And secondly, action standards allow clients to take action on research results. Without action standards, managers can often say, the results of the research are interesting. I learned a lot about the market, but I'm not sure what to do next. So some of the impediments to problem definition: failure to change behavior for problem definition situations. Most managers don't want to deal with outside consultants, and traditionally managers were generalists and researchers are technicians. So there's a difference in the viewpoint of a manager and a researcher. So then we come up with the marketing research proposal. It does several things. It states the problem. It states the research objectives. It details the research method, and it contains a timetable, and it contains a budget. All right, any questions on chapter 3? Okay.